Hey sailors, welcome to the crew. I'm Sea Lord Janda, and this is a Rule the Waves 3 USA campaign special. All the world's fighting ships. We will be looking through. Basically, this episode is for the particular naval geeks among you. I'm going to be looking through and seeing what kind of weird and potentially wonderful designs that myself and the AI have come up with. Basically, a catalog of the world's naval fighting power in January of 1900. There won't be any actions, so for those of you who are interested in that, skip this one and go to the next part of the proper campaign. This isn't even the primary save, it's a secondary one that keen eyed observers might have seen me make in January 1900. So, first of all, the only way I can really do this that I know of is through the almanac, through which we can see all the ships of the world. Our data won't necessarily be perfect on them, but it should hopefully be pretty good. First of all, I have, okay, so we can see the fleet tonnages everyone has here, but I've assembled a little graph to show some of the data on that. This is the world's current tonnage of ships. There are 149 operational battleships in the world as of January 1900. 118 armored cruisers, 108 protected cruisers, and 400 destroyers. I suspect that that's significantly more than actually existed in real January 1900, but I haven't done the math to be absolutely sure. Unsurprisingly, battleships are the majority of that by tonnage, although there are a lot of cruisers around in the world. Britain possesses slightly over 1/4 of the entire world's tonnage, with France, Germany, Russia, and Italy the main powers after that. The remaining four, which are Japan, Austria, Hungary, Spain, and ourselves, don't even account for a full quarter of the world's tonnage at the moment. The big five are over 75%. And it's much the same story in terms of battleships. Britain has 39, and the second strongest power, France, has 22. Germany's at 21, Russia 19. Austria-Hungary has an unreasonably large percentage of battleships at 13, whereas we're tied with Japan on 6 for least currently, but we did at the moment of January 1900 have 4 building, so that would change a bit within the next couple of years. Austria's battleships, however, are all, well, we'll see what they are pretty shortly. So I'm not going to devote too much time to destroyers at this point, if only because in January 1900, there really isn't very much difference between any of them. The American destroyer fleet consists entirely of 20 Barry class destroyers. I'm not going to read out all of their names. You can probably see them here. Every one of them can make 26 knots, has a single 3-inch gun, and 2 centerline mounted single above water torpedo tubes. In all reality, these are torpedo boats rather than destroyers, but so be it. And all the rest of the world, all 400 of the destroyers currently in the world, are much the same. There is some design variation we can go over. The Spanish have divided theirs into 4 classes by the look of it, but I would say these first 3 classes, the Destructor, Führer, and Melilla classes, are almost identical. Allegedly, they do 27 knots, which is 1 more than us, but by the look of it, they have exactly the same armament. So, in essence, they're basically the same ship as what we have. And it looks like it is the same for these other 2 Führer and Melilla classes. The main design variant that we have is the Lepanto class here, which is this is more like a destroyer, or what you can build of a destroyer on 300 tons. It actually still has the 2 above water torpedo tubes centerline, but in addition to the 3-inch gun, it mounts 6 2-inch guns. And how it manages to pack all that in is by dropping 3 knots from the top speed of the other design. 24 knots is barely faster than a cruiser in this era, but it's just a little bit faster than a cruiser. And it gives it a pretty considerable firepower advantage over other destroyers. So this is almost if the first designs we were talking about were torpedo boats, this is an actual torpedo boat destroyer, as they would say. Just to run through the other powers, I've mentioned the U.S., Austria, Hungary. No, it's actually, I believe Japan has. Let me check here. Austria Hungary has the next least tonnage, so let's go through them quickly. They have primarily the Boa and Elan classes, which allegedly make up to 28 knots, but are otherwise identical to the torpedo boat design we talked about. And then more recently, they've built the Triglav and Dukla classes, which are more along the lines of the torpedo boat destroyer type. However, they make 26 knots. These actually would be quite alarming compared to ours, I suspect. Although our destroyers are also cramped, I think, so I'm not quite sure how they packed all that tonnage into them, honestly. Let me see the design here. Yeah, cramped. They might have low freeboard. That might spare... It only spares a little bit of tonnage. Hard to see. Of course, we have a lot of free weight. We just couldn't really fit more guns on. Interesting. I wonder if with the advance of technology, we actually could fit all these guns on. Yeah, we could. Okay. So I've just discovered we're not going to redesign these because I'm pretty sure we've already designed a 400 or 500 ton destroyer in the campaign as it goes, but these could have been redesigned with more guns by this point. Aside from that, we take a look at Japan quickly. Interestingly, well, first of all, they didn't really start building destroyers until 1897, which is pretty late. We started building our first ones by 1895. And they launched straight into the Namikaze class, which has 4 2-inch guns and makes 27 knots. This is basically the design I just saw that we could build with the more modern technology, so it might have paid off to delay a couple of years. And they also have the Asakaze class, which has the full 6 2-inch guns but loses a knot of speed. And most recently of all, ironically, they've gone the opposite way of some of the others, as they've started building the Hatakaze class, which has another extra knot of speed for the full 28 knots, but is back down to just 1 3-inch gun. Moving into the larger powers, Italy has primarily the Fulmine, and Austria-Hungary has a total of... Spain has a total of 25 destroyers, 32, and Japan 29. They're all 300 tonners in the case of all three of those countries. As you can see, we step it up pretty drastically to the big 4 or the big 5 that there currently are, as Italy has 47 destroyers in service, all 300 tonners. They started out with the Fulmine class, which has the 6 2-inch guns, but only makes 26 knots. Followed it with the Austro class, which drops 2 of the 2-inch guns for 27 knots. The Artiglieri class, which somehow makes 28 knots. I guess just the advance of technology has an extra knot compared to the Austros. And then the pretty big Pontiere class, which... Assuming our data about it is correct, is just kind of strange, as it only makes the 26 knots with 1 3-inch gun. It might actually make 28, but it's hard to say. Sometimes our data is imperfect. More recently, they've had the Antonio Mosto class, which is the classic torpedo boat destroyer type, and the Carlo Mirabello class, which is that, but faster at 26 knots, the latest technology, presumably. Russia is inevitably a bit behind in technology, but they do have 52 destroyers in service, all 300 tonners. They actually initially built the Bravi class, which is the torpedo boat destroyer type, although theirs made 25 knots. However, they then built the Boldri, Vesely, Zvonki, Iskusny, and Krepki classes, which all are basically just torpedo boats, 1 3-inch gun, 28 knots, and the 2 torpedo tubes. I don't believe that there's any... Well, apparently these only make 27 knots, but that could be faulty intelligence. Functionally, these are all basically interchangeable. And then most recently they've begun building the Tokni and Strozhevoy classes, which are more torpedo boat destroyer types again, a bit slower, but with quite a few 2-inch guns mounted on them. Moving into the big three, we have Germany, which has 55 destroyers operational, all 300-tonners as well. And they started off with now Germany doesn't really name their destroyers. They started off with the V1 class, which are strictly torpedo boats, the pretty standard torpedo boat design, and then moved into the S-21 class, which is sort of balanced because it has 4 2-inch guns, but is basically more of a torpedo boat destroyer design. They maintained 27 knots with it, though. They must have pretty good tech. The S-24 class lost a knot, but piled 2 more 2-inch guns on. And then the S-33 class was really just a repeat, I would say, of the S-21 class. And more recently, they've had the G-42 class, which is another pure torpedo boat design. The S-49 class, which is also a pure torpedo boat design, but has an extra knot of speed. However, they only built a couple before shifting to the S-51 class, which loses that knot again. I don't exactly. There's probably more internal changes that we can't exactly see. Like, these might be less cramped or something, or have higher freeboard, which might explain the difference. Now, Britain, of course, is the king of the seas. They have 87 destroyers. And in the year 1900, they are the only ones with any destroyers above 300 tons actually operational. And they have built almost entirely proper torpedo boat destroyers as well. They started off with the Desperate class, which made 26 knots and had 4 2-inch guns in the torpedo boat destroyer type layout, and followed that with the Mallard, which adds 2 more 2-inch guns. Then the Stag class, which is basically, I don't know how it's improved from Mallard, but it's probably a little bit improved incrementally. Then the Eden class, which again is basically the same design, but probably has some incremental improvement of some sort, or maybe not. I think the AI just iterates on classes whether it really needs to or not. They then did build one run, the Swale class of pure torpedo boats, although allegedly they're not any faster than their torpedo boat destroyers, so I don't know why. Before moving right back into torpedo boat destroyers with, again, the functionally seemingly identical Gala Liffey. Well, Liffey class at least has a little one extra knot of speed. Kennet, Saracen, and Kennet class. Then they made one more run of torpedo boats with the Saracen class, one more run of fast torpedo boat destroyers with the Foxhound class, and actually one more run after that with the Basilisk class. And finally, in just the last year, they've begun building the 400-ton Rattlesnake class, which has 2 3-inch guns, 4 2-inch guns, and 2 torpedo tubes, while making 27 knots. This is currently the most powerful destroyer in the world. Obviously, it's not exactly terrifying, but even on 400 tons, there's only so much you can do, and it would almost certainly beat any of the 300-ton designs in a one-on-one fight. There is quite a lot of randomness, of course. Any torpedo hit would annihilate them. They also have the Chameleon class, which are 400-tonners, but don't apparently have the extra 2-inch gun, nor are they especially fast, so I'm not quite sure what they're getting out of the Chameleon class. Maybe something, though. They might not be short-ranged. And if they aren't short-ranged, that would be a big advantage for the British Empire, of course, considering how sprawling they are. Okay, so that's destroyers. Let's take a quick look at the light cruisers of the world. Interestingly, the light, or probably at this point they're right on the transition between protected and light cruisers, terminology-wise. They're actually the least numerous category of ship in the world. I believe there are less of them than there are armored cruisers or battleships. Let me check that real quick. Yeah, that's correct. As I said before, or as the chart before showed, there's 108 protected cruisers, 118 armored cruisers, and 149 battleships in the world, and of course 400 destroyers. So the protected cruisers are actually the least numerous class of ship currently in existence. And the US doesn't even have the least, as Austria-Hungary does, which kind of makes sense because I don't really see what the utility of protected cruisers for Austria-Hungary actually is. They sort of want to have, a couple of them for showing the flag type purposes, which aren't even really modeled in game, just to sail around the world. But they don't have any colonies or anything, so they really have no need to operate outside the Adriatic. Anyway, the U.S. fleet is small, but to be fair, it does have more tonnage than the Spanish fleet, which has one more ship, and the Japanese fleet, which has two more. Anyway, so let's jump into the designs. Well, let's look at the U.S. first. You're probably all familiar with the Chicago class: Chicago, Columbia, Baltimore, Cincinnati, San Francisco, and Raleigh. This is a pre-generated design, but it's one I actually found to be pretty good. 5,600 tons, 22 knots, armed with 10 6-inch guns, of which 4 are in twin turrets, fore and aft, and 3 are mounted on each side. This is about the most efficient layout you're realistically going to get in 1890, plus 8 2-inch guns for secondaries, a 2-inch armor belt, a 2-inch deck, which is really overkill, to be honest, but I believe that's how part of the... No, it's actually not. Armored cruisers had an armored deck. Protected cruisers really didn't. That's sort of how they were defined, but the game doesn't necessarily pick up on niceties like that. Anyway, this is a pre-generated design, and there's a lot of pretty much identical cruisers around out there, but I find it to be a pretty good design. It definitely needs updating now. I can't remember if I've done it yet in 1900. I don't think so. But I think by this point in the campaign, I've finally designed a new light cruiser. I haven't yet in 1900, but within a few years, the Chicagos will have to get a more modern successor class. So just to page through the world's navies, then Spain has 7 light cruisers. They do have, and they haven't built a single light cruiser since the start of the game. The U.S. has built 4 out of the even, well, this one was finishing when the game started, and then we built 4 more since. Spain hasn't built a single new protected cruiser since the start of the game. They have the Aragon and Gravina, both Aragon class cruisers. These are very small at 3,100 tons, and with only 6 4-inch and 6 2-inch guns. They have a decent armor belt, but really these are barely cruisers. I mean, there are destroyers in the late game. Not even the late game, now that there's guided missiles and stuff, but like a World War II era destroyer would probably beat this ship hands down. Yeah, it really would, I think, quite easily. Then they have the Galicia, which has 4 5-inch and 4 4-inch and 8 2-inch guns, makes 22 knots. Quite, well, I mean, I shouldn't say that thinly armored. It's a light cruiser. It's never going to be that well armored. Ours only have, what, 2-inch belt? Yeah. So I can't complain too much about the armor, but the armament is strange and relatively light. They've got no real, what you would consider cruiser caliber guns, 6 inches and up. It's... I hesitate to say it's a terrible cruiser, but its use is kind of strange. Then they have the Castilla class, which has only 2 5-inch guns, and the rest are all 10 3-inch, 8 2-inch guns. You would have to basically say the only role you could maybe see this fulfilling is an anti-destroyer cruiser, basically. In the modern era, it might be an anti-aircraft cruiser, but obviously it's not going to have that kind of elevation or tracking capacity. This is more like an anti-torpedo boat type cruiser, which could actually be viable, but it won't be any good at all against other cruisers. Then they have the Navarra class, Navarra and Don Antonio de Ulloa. These are both exact clones of our pre-generated Chicago design. They didn't steal it, I stole it from the game files, in effect. And then they also built a second Castilla, the Infanta Isabel. So all told, only 2 of their light cruisers actually match ours for size. The other 5, I would say, are barely worthy of being called cruisers. I mean, the Galicia, which is the best, only has 4 5-inch and 4 4-inch guns, which hopeless against something with 10 6-inch guns. Now, Japan has 8 light cruisers, fairly light on average. In fact, none of them are the tonnage of our modern designs, but let's see what they have here. They have built also no new light cruisers since the start of the game, which is interesting. The AI is not prioritizing that for some reason. They have Naniwa, which has 8 5-inch and 8 3-inch guns, 22 knots. This is not terrible, but it's interesting that it's almost the tonnage of a Chicago class, only 400 tons less. And the 8 5-inch guns is a lot less than 10 6-inch guns, really. So I'm not sure. I mean, I would just put the expense for the extra 400 tons in at that point. Then Takachiho, a very small one-off with 6 4-inch and 6 2-inch guns, and slow at 20 knots. I think this is a replica of the Spanish Aragon class, and it's not very good, yeah. They do have 2 other Takachihos, though, Chishima and Yayama. So those are a problem for them, really. They have the Izumi class, which doesn't have a generated picture. Oh, no, I see, okay. I don't know why it defaulted to pictures to the game view. The Izumi class, the sisters Izumi and Onibi, which have 2 5-inch guns. These are, again, the anti-torpedo boat type design. And they'd be decent in that role, but again, they'd struggle against any real cruisers. So they have the 2 other Takachihos, and then they have the interesting design. Chiyoda has 2 8-inch guns, which traditionally are sort of the preserve of heavier cruisers, but 2 8-inch guns, 8 6-inch guns, 10 3-inch guns, 2.5-inch armor belt, capable of 21 knots. This thing is actually a pretty good fighting light cruiser. It has more firepower than the Chicago class on a 300-ton less hull. The only disadvantage is that at 21 knots, it's a Chicago could run away from it if it so desired. And it doesn't have that much more firepower, but it's a very solid design. It's quite interesting. I mean, in isolation, a Chicago could run away from it, but in a larger fleet type setting, this would just be better, most likely. So, not a bad design at all. And then they have the Itsukushima, which is that, but they cheaped out on it. 2 8-inch guns, 6 6-inch guns, 10 2-inch guns. So they've stripped off 2 6-inch guns, and they've lowered all the 3-inch guns to 2-inch. And they've cut, what, a knot from the speed? Or 2? They've cut a knot from the speed to 20 knots, which is still fast enough to outrun battleships, but at this point, noticeably slower than, 2 or 3 knots slower than most of the cruisers out there. It does have pretty thick armor at 3 inches, but that's still not thick armor overall. Likely 8 and 6-inch guns won't have too much trouble penetrating that at this point. She's 4,500 tons. Let me check quickly our, just so I can confirm. Let's see what 6-inch guns do. Well, see, the difference between 2.5 inches and 3 inches is about 2,000 yards of penetration at this point. And it's about 4,000 from 2 inches of armor, so that could be worth it. It could well be, but on the other hand, accuracy at anything other than point-blank range is still pretty bad at this point. It's starting to change. We just got central range finding, or I don't think we have it yet in January 1900, but we just got it in the campaign a couple years later, so we're getting there. But for now, well, let's put it this way. This is cheaper than Chiyoda, but not as good. It's still, with the 8-inch guns, would still pose a definite threat to even a bigger cruiser in a fight, though. Those are pretty big for its size. Okay, and then we have Austria-Hungary should be up next. They only have 5 protected cruisers, as I previously mentioned, which is the smallest fleet in the world. And to be fair, they don't really have much of a role for them. The bulk of their protected cruiser fleet is the Zenta, Zigetvar, and Helgoland. which are all these 5,200-ton sort of balanced cruisers with 8 5-inch and 8 3-inch guns and capable of 23 knots. These are, eh, they're just, they're decent but not outstanding all-around cruisers. They don't have any really good plus qualities. They would almost certainly lose in a stand-up fight with a Chicago, which is only 400 tons heavier, as I said, but they're not terrible. They would certainly destroy destroyers, and there's a lot of worse cruiser designs floating around in the world, too. Now, here's an anomaly. This is sort of like the idea Japan had with their. What was the second one called? With the Chiyoda class and the Itsukushima. But. Where was it? Oh, this is Italy. Where was it? Saida here takes it to the extreme with a pair of 10-inch guns, which are at least armored cruiser, if not even like small battleship caliber, really, at this point. Plus 6 6-inch guns, plus 16 2-inch guns. This is almost certainly this is easily the best armed light cruiser we've seen so far, but at the same time, and I think overgunned is modeled in the game. I've seen it somewhere on one of the pre-generated ships. This is probably liable to like snap itself in half when it fires, honestly, or at least have terrible accuracy as a result. And even if it doesn't, it's quite slow for a cruiser. Decent armor, though. It's kind of impressive how much they shoved onto this tonnage, but it is definitely at the cost of it being this slow. It's. Well, let's put it this way. You've got to be weary of it, because you can't be lured into a fight with, a single light cruiser and then get walloped by a couple of 10-inch guns that you really didn't expect a light cruiser to have. But if you notice it and you engage it with, say, a proper armored cruiser, it will probably get destroyed despite its heavy guns because it's not fast enough and ultimately not armored enough. And then the last of their ships is Admiral Spawn, which is one of those really small 3,100-ton types. They only make 20 knots, and with 6 4-inch, 6 2-inch guns, they don't have anything to make up for that. They're pretty poor. So from there, we move into the Big Five with Italy. Italy's light cruiser force consists of 7 ships, and is the first one that's actually got more tonnage than the US, although not by much, so they're still smaller on average. They have Tripoli and Gali of the Giovanni Bossan class, which are. These are Chicago clones again, which, to be fair, are some of the best cruisers out there, in my somewhat biased opinion. Then they have Partenope, which is. Wow, quite an astonishingly heavy cruiser, actually, with 2 8-inch guns, 10 6-inch guns, albeit none of them are in twin turrets. It's basically 5 to a side here, and 16 2-inch guns, plus a 2.5-inch armor belt. Only makes 21 knots, but that's still better than 20, and it packs a heck of a lot of firepower, so this is actually a light cruiser to watch out for, especially as it's only 5,100 tons, because speed is so expensive in this era still. So expensive. And it always is, but it's really costly here before turbine engines are developed. Then they have little Eurydice, which is one of these small ones with only 5-inch and 4-inch guns. It does at least make 21 knots, but it only has an 1.5-inch belt. It's not that good. Then Irid, which is another one of these that packs in. Well, we've seen one of these. Japan. This is like the Japanese design, I believe. Yeah. 2 8-inch, 8 6-inch, 10 3-inch guns with a 2.5-inch belt. Only 20 knots, which isn't very fast, but a good deal of firepower, so not hopeless. And then they have 2 of this Arethusa class, which again are a clone of something I've mentioned before. They're basically pretty balanced cruisers, but not at all exceptional, and honestly, they would lose to most of the other cruiser designs over 5,000 tons that we've seen. So they're not exceptional at all. Russia has Russia has the second largest light cruiser force in the world, and by a deceptive margin, even because it's really much bigger by tonnage than Germany's. It's only slightly larger than France's, and of course much smaller than Britain's, which is enormous. But Russia has invested pretty heavily in light cruisers, although it's still only built one since the start of the game. I didn't check that with the last couple. Japan didn't build any. Italy hasn't built any. Austria-Hungary has built any. Yeah, nobody's building these. Russia has built one that was probably already under construction at the start of the game. Okay. So out of their 15 light cruisers, they have two Diana class, which are the little 3,100 tonners with only 4 and 2-inch guns, and slow. These are quite useless. They do have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 Vesta class cruisers. The Vesta, Svetlana, Aurora, Flora, Vladimir, Nadezhda, Pamyat, Mercuria, Novik, and Rinda, which are all Chicago clones. So they have 9 of these, I just counted, right? 3, 6, 9. Yeah, 9 of these to our 6 of basically the exact same ship. So that's pretty impressive. I mean, this is actually quite a powerful protected cruiser force. And then in their later, more experimental designs, they have the Oprichnik, which is one of these that has a couple of 8-inch guns along with 6-inch. Now, it's relatively slow, but it does have good armor. This would be dangerous in a stand-up fight, but most things can run away from it, to be fair. Except battleships, but battleships will annihilate it. And it's not necessarily a lot faster than armored cruisers of this era, either. Then we have Vesta, which is... Oh, this is a 10th Vesta, actually. It was just separated from the others by completion. The Boyarin. So they have 10 of these Chicago clones. And then finally, Vovoda and Greden, which are small 3,300-ton ships with only 5, 4, and 2-inch guns, and they only make 20 knots thin armor. These are not very good, but these 10 Chicago clones are a pretty impressive fleet. Then Germany has 12 light cruisers, but it's actually a little deceptive because you'll notice their tonnage is not anywhere near double ours. They must have a very small average. They also have, well, they've technically built one since the start of the game. It might actually be a new design, but it might have been under construction at game start. They have 4 of the Geffion class, which are honestly might actually... I don't think they're a clone of the literal actual German Geffion class, because I think those were like 1904 or something, the ones I'm thinking of, but this is a very German style, like early German style light cruiser for sure, that everyone else has gotten saddled with because it's in the pre-generated designs for the start of the game. With all these 4 and 2-inch guns, yes, it's got decent armor, but it's too slow and too underarmed. Most other light cruisers will deal with these. They have 4 Geffion, Hela, Gazelle, and Nymph. Now, they do have Niobe and Thetis. These two are both Chicago clones again. And then they have 5 more Geffions: Ariadne, Amazone, Frauenlob, Medusa, and Arcona. Okay, so they have 9 of these out of their, 12 light cruisers? Yeah, that's not... Germany actually has, therefore, one of the most ineffective protected cruiser forces out of anyone in the game, because all 9 of these are really almost useless. I mean, they would do a number on a destroyer, but not on pretty much any other light cruiser design. And then lastly, the only one they finished after the start of the game is Bremen here, which is one of the designs that slaps a couple of 8-inch guns on as the mains, along with 6-inch guns. It is slow, but it's well armored. It's a pretty decent design. Okay, 2 powers to go for the light cruisers. We have France has 13 light cruisers, which is the 3rd largest force in the world behind Russia's. And they also have not really built any since the start of the game. Apparently, nobody has. They have Sphax and Quetlagon, which are these small 3100 tonners, the Geffion type, maybe I should call them. They're not very good, of course. And then they have Taga, Davut, Suket, Amaral Cecile, Surkov, Forbin, Cosmo, and Alger. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 Chicago clones, identical to our Chicago's. And then they have Trude Lalande and Eastleigh, which are all 4,500 tonners of the type that have 8-inch guns shoehorned into them. These are the more compromised design with the 8-inch guns and are not, in my opinion, all that good. I think despite the 8-inch guns that a Chicago could certainly outrun them and might be able to outfight them, but it's not a certainty. They're pretty dangerous in a brawl, just not. They'd have trouble fulfilling the purpose of a protected cruiser in terms of chasing down destroyers or anything like that, or shielding the fleet. And then finally, by far, 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 the world's largest fleet of light cruisers, more than, yeah, comfortably more than the next three powers combined. Honestly, tonnage wise, I mean, just guesstimate about 80, 140, 210, 240, call it 320. I mean, honestly, the whole rest of the world combined, as far as I can tell, barely has more tonnage than Britain's 35 light cruisers here. They have one, two. Oh, it is because of this class. Okay. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 Diadem class cruisers. Diadem, Niobe, Andromeda, Amphitrite, Comus, Caracoa, Champion, Cleopatra, Conquest, Carisfort, Constance, Canada, and Cordelius, which each have 14 6-inch guns, plus 2 4-inch, 8 2-inch. They only make 20 knots, but they have a 4-inch armor belt. Now, they do clock in at 9,100 tons, which means they are very expensive for light cruisers. But on the other hand, this is the British Empire we're talking about. The Royal Navy can afford very expensive light cruisers much more than anybody else can. And these are really going to be pretty formidable with that grade of 6-inch armament. And that size in itself actually is sort of that size in and of itself will give it the ability to absorb more damage to a certain extent. On the other hand, the layout I see, they don't really have any twin turrets. They have side-by-side turrets fore and aft, which probably means they only have 7 guns to a side. And honestly, as Chicago has effectively also 7 guns to a side because of the twin turrets. Yeah, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I'm not sure, although the Diadems are definitely a powerful ship, considering their, well, the armor helps, of course. I'm not entirely convinced they're really that much more powerful than a Chicago, certainly not for the enormous amount of extra tonnage. But that armor belt definitely helps, because let me take another look at the gun penetrations. Yeah, I mean, 4 inches is enough that 6-inch guns of this time are going to have trouble penetrating her beyond about 1,000 yards, which is a really pretty close range even in 1900. So that's a pretty powerful line of cruisers Britain have there. And that's just the first class, of course. They have Argonaut and Cressy, which, to be fair, appear to be the same ship. I assume there's some internal changes, but basically the same design. They have Europa Argonaut and Cressy. Sorry, I didn't miss the third one. They're the Europa class. And then they have Leander, Arethusa, and Phaeton, which are the Leander class. Which are actually, these are the more mediocre 5,200 ton ones that only have 5 and 3-inch guns. These are actually nothing special. Then they have the Ariadne and Spartiate, which are, whew, these are basically the Diadem class, but they've swapped two of their 6-inch guns for a pair of 9-inch guns forward and aft. Plus, they have concentrated what was two 4-inch and eight 2-inch guns, and they've managed to somehow squeeze in 16 3-inch guns, plus a 4-inch belt, plus an extra knot of speed for 21 knots. Now, these two, Ariadne and Spartiate, they must be hellishly expensive for light cruisers, but they are terrifying, actually. So far as I can tell, this could blow any other light cruiser in the world out of the water. Mind, I haven't gotten to Britain's newest designs yet, but this is actually fairly terrifying. Now, no, this is a pre-generated design. That said, Britain has built a few new light cruisers since the start of the game. Not many, but these are all pre-generated up to this point, which makes them extra terrifying, arguably. Then they have 1, 2, 3, 4 your Yalis class, your Yalis, Sutlej, Good Hope, and Abu Kir, which are, these are just returns to a complete clone of Diadem. I feel like there's some improvements. Like I would just drop the 4-inch guns and they have a uniform armament of 3-inch guns or even of 2-inch guns. But I mean, it's clearly inferior, I would say, to the Ariadne class, which just sort of perfects the design. But I'm guessing this is a good deal more expensive in some ways, especially that extra knot of speed. Oh, this does have the extra knot of speed that the Diadems didn't, right? Yeah. So that's the improvement here. Then they have Calypso, which, funnily enough, this is just a Chicago clone, but they've only got, what, one of these in their entire enormous fleet? Yeah. Whereas there's, like, France is just relying almost entirely on them, and so is Russia. Britain, with its massive fleet, only has one. Okay. They have Calliope and Pandora, which are... These are the compact 8-inch gun design, which I feel is pretty compromised, but as I said, still a lot of brawling power. Calliope and Pandora. And then, okay, they have built a couple of pre-start or post-start of game ships, which is the first we've seen of that in the light cruisers. They have Phoenix, which is a 7,700-ton cruiser, which, you know, appears to in every other way be identical to the Diadem class. 20 knots, 4-inch belt, 14 sixes, 2 4s, 8 2s. There's also one more Diadem stuffed down here, Amphion. I think this is identical in every way in terms of capabilities, which means just that with like post-game tech, they were apparently able to save 1,400 tons off the displacement, which presumably means that this ship is much more affordable than any of the Diadems were, and they could build a lot more of them. But to be fair, they haven't so far. Phoenix is alone in her class, and they followed her with Psyche and Pallas, which are 4,300-ton designs, and not really impressive ones. 6 5-inch guns, 6 2-inch guns. Decent armor belt, but really these are not particularly good fighting cruisers. And then most recently, they've built Persian as a one-off, followed by Phoebe and Pelaris as a pair, and they look pretty similar to Persian, so that's why I mentioned them immediately. Now, Persian is basically... It's a little step down from... Now, to be fair, I'm really not sure how they fit all of... Oh, this is without the 9-inch guns, so that's how. But this is a further refinement of basically the Spartiate and Ariadne design. In fact, to the point that it has 2-9, 12-6, 16-3. Yeah. By comparison, Persian here has the same armament, 1 inch less of armor, but 1 knot more of speed, and shaves 1,100 tons off the weight, which will make it quite a lot cheaper. It would probably still lose in a stand-up fight with Ariadne and Spartiate, but not by much, just because of that extra inch less of armor. At close range, it wouldn't matter much. Phoebe and Pelaris here are... They then make the weird compromise of sticking half an inch of that belt armor back on, but at the cost of 2 knots of speed, which I'm not. I mean, it will technically make them more effective in an actual battle, but I'm not too sure about that as a concept for a light cruiser. They're really supposed to be pretty fast, these cruisers, you know? But these British Phoebe, Persian, Ariadne, and even the diadems in general, but especially these the 9-inch gun designs, these are. I mean, first of all, these really should be armored cruisers. Like, really? But they're very powerful for light cruisers, and they get light cruiser matchmaking, which is a thing. So that's horrifying. Okay. Now we move on to the armored cruisers of the world. Now, Britain. Huh. You know, remarkably enough, that is apparently where Britain has skimped because that's the only category they don't have a huge superiority in. I also find it's very interesting that they're allegedly behind in technological development. But literally everyone except Germany is either average or behind. So apparently Germany has really got something cooking in their naval labs. How Russia has managed to achieve average, I do not know, especially when Britain and France are behind. But anyway, this is the one group Britain doesn't have a clear preponderance in. Germany has more tonnage of armored cruisers than Britain, which is really weird. Anyway, the U.S. fleet first. They're divided into 4 classes. The New York class, New York, Brooklyn, Rochester, and San Diego. These were a pre-generated design, and I hate them. They are 4,400 tons, which you'll notice is literally smaller than our pre-generated protected cruisers. They only make 18 knots. They do have a 4-inch belt and a 2-inch deck, which the 4-inch belt counts for something. But with 2 7-inch guns, 6 5-inch, and 8 2-inch, I'm genuinely not convinced that the New York class would actually beat a Chicago class light cruiser in a stand-up fight. And if they ever started to, the Chicago could easily outrun them to escape because they have 4 extra knots of speed. These are really bad armored cruisers, and I've only held on to them because we need something to stick on the colonies. And these pretty much fit the bill because we didn't have very many light cruisers. But within a couple of years of 1900, I did get rid of these. Then really one of our first big designs we did make for ourselves, the 5 Pittsburgh class armored cruisers, Pittsburgh, Huntington, Huron, Pueblo, and Frederick. These are 8,000-ton armored cruisers capable of 21 knots. They have 4 8-inch guns in twin turrets, fore and aft, 8 6-inch guns, 4 to a side, 10 3-inch guns, a 4-inch belt, and a 1.5-inch deck. I skimped a little on the deck because guns in this first decade really don't get enough arc to have any significant deck penetrating power. I think still now, that's changing now, but even now, 8-inch guns are actually have zero deck penetration. Even battleship guns in 1900 don't have the capacity to punch through any significant amount of deck. 1.5 inches is actually still overkill for most of the peak useful fighting period of the Pittsburghs. So I think these are a pretty well balanced fighting armored cruiser for the 1890s. 8-inch guns are actually probably on the small side for what you could stick on an armored cruiser. A future class might even have 9-inch guns, the last armored cruiser class before the battle cruisers, but this is a pretty well-rounded and powerful design in my opinion, but I haven't compared it in detail to everything everyone else has around. And they have recently been succeeded by the 1,000-ton heavier Memphis class, Memphis, Salt Lake City, and Charlotte. I shouldn't say exactly succeeded because they're serving concurrently, but these are the newest armored cruisers of the fleet. As you can see, I skipped even more on the deck armor down to 1 inch, but they still have a 4-inch belt, 9,000 tons, 1 extra knot of speed for 22 knots, and we've managed to stick an extra 8-inch gun onto either side, plus 10 6-inch guns rather than 8, and 2 extra 3-inch guns as well. Basically, two extra guns of every caliber, plus an extra knot of speed at the cost of it's 1,000 tons heavier and half an inch of deck armor that really is of questionable value. It's probably a little. We'll see as we go through this. It might be a little under armored at this point, to tell you the truth, but I think it should hold up pretty well still in terms of firepower and such. And this is actually one of our strongest arms relative to the world. We have 84,000 tons of armored cruisers, which is more than. I say that, but it's actually only more than Russia and Spain's. Because for some reason, the AI has quite a lot of armored cruisers for the most part, except Britain. More of these powers than not have more armor than they do light cruisers. Now, Spain only has 9, which is the least out of anybody. It's still quite a few for the situation Spain is in, really. They do have the smallest fleet of them, though. Oh, yes, and they have built. These everyone has built since the start of the game, unlike their light cruisers. Emperador Carlos V is their earliest, 7,300 tons, 21 knots. These have 4 7-inch guns, 8 6-inch, 12 3-inch, and a 4-inch belt. Not a bad design. Would just marginally lose to our 8 and 9,000 ton cruisers because of the 7-inch guns, but fairly solid example of an early armored cruiser. But then they have Cristobal Colon here is a New York clone and is terrible. And then they have 3 Infanta Maria Teresas. Infanta Maria Teresa, Pedro de Aragon, and Reina Mercedes. These are all pretty solid again. They're very similar to the Emperador Carlos V, but they have, I think, 12, 3, 4-inch belt. They're basically a cheap version. They have the same armament, but half an inch less of belt armor, and they are a knot slower, but they save 300 tons and are probably at least marginally cheaper. I don't know if the cost saving would really be worth it, but they think it was apparently. And then they've built the big Vizcaya and Almirante Oquendo more recently in 1895. These are very slow for armored cruisers at 18 knots, but they're big, 8,700 tons. They've got 6 8-inch guns, which matches our newest Memphis class. However, 12 5s and 10 2s is a relatively light secondary tertiary armament. They've cut half an inch of belt off, and 18 knots is slow. This reads almost like an attempt to match Memphis, except it's not in the literal sense because Memphis wasn't completed until 2 years later. But it's kind of like a low-tech proto-Memphis almost. It clearly suffers for it. It's not fast enough for a cruiser. It loses that little bit of armor, and the secondaries are not as good. And at 8,700 tons, it's only marginally smaller and cheaper. I think that a Pittsburgh would have a good chance against this, and a Memphis would probably beat it 3 times out of 4. Their luck is a factor in the armament being very similar, but for the marginal cost savings, I would much rather have a Memphis. And then their newest, Cardinal Jimenez de Cisneros, is really... Is it like a modernized New York clone? 2766? No, it's heavier than that, but it's weird. I mean, okay. 2 7-inch guns, 6 6-inch guns, 8 2-inch guns. 3.5-inch belt, 20 knots. I mean, it's basically a small armored cruiser. Because of the armor, it will at least beat most light cruisers out there. On the other hand, the British light cruisers would actually destroy it, but they're much bigger. They're just weird. They really probably should be armored cruisers, but our armored cruisers would beat it hands down. But to make up the numbers, it's not a bad design. It would beat most light cruisers, I think. And then their most recent is the Princesa de Asturias, which is exactly the same as Cardinal Jimenez, I would say, except they've cut another... They've replaced the 6-inch guns with 5-inch guns on the newer one, and in so doing managed to cut another 400 tons out of it. That just reeks of needing to, like, they had the budget for not quite another one of these and wanted an armored cruiser, so they built this, but this is just straight up inferior. And the 5 inch, I mean, the two 7 inch guns are the only real cruiser grade guns now. That's not that good. Moving on, Austria-Hungary has a really potent force of armored cruisers for its size, 13 of them. Starting with the Kaiserin und Königin Maria Theresa and the Sankt George, which are one of these classes that has a mix of 7 inch primaries with 6 inch secondaries. So it's basically sort of, well, it's a heavy cruiser, or an armored cruiser, but it's a little on the light side without really big guns. However, it's quite nice, and 22 knots is a good deal of speed, so it's not a bad design at all. And they followed those with the 4 Donau class, Donau, Kaiser Karl IV, Schwarzenberg, and Minerva, which have very similar, well, 4, 7, 8, 6. Okay, I mean, they drop the dual 7 inch. I didn't even comment on that. These actually do have twin turret 7 inch guns. That's pretty nice. A lot of the Spanish ships, I think. Oh, no, they all did. Okay. Well, this one didn't, but it sucks. So the Donos drop the twin turret 7 inch guns, which is definitely hurts, but they have a lot of 6 inch guns packed into here and a thick armor belt. They're a little slow. This would be, the lack of heavy guns might really hurt it against other armored cruisers, but it would be very good at tearing up light cruisers, probably. They followed that with Adria and Lissa, 1894, which are, this is a very bog standard armored cruiser, really. 4 8-inch guns, 10 6-inch guns, 12 3-inch guns, 4-inch belt, 20 knots. It's almost identical, probably, to like our Pittsburgh. 4 8, 10 6. Yeah, actually, it's marginally better armored, or better armed, that is, but drops a knot of speed. But it's a very nice, pretty standard armored cruiser. I like it. Then they built Frunsburg and Maros, which are much bigger. Much bigger, but interestingly, even slower at 19 tons, and only 4 7-inch guns, plus a heavy, heavy armament of 6-inch guns. Well, especially if you get to close range where the 6-inch guns would penetrate, it would be very good. So I'm not going to condemn it, but I would rather have 8-inch guns for myself. They followed that with the smaller Letha and Markburg, which have 2 7-inch and 10 6-inch, back up to 20 knots, but only a 2.5-inch belt, which is probably a pretty fatal flaw for an armored cruiser, actually, because it's barely more armored than a protected cruiser or a light cruiser at that point. And its armament is not that much heavier. I mean, the 2 7-inch guns are good, but this thing is only marginally superior to a Chicago-class protected cruiser, which is 2,300 tons lighter, so I'm not sure I love this at all. And the very most recent from 1898 is Klagenfurt, which has 4 8-inch guns, 8 6-inch guns, 3.5-inch belt, 20 knots. Bit of a compromise not having the full 4-inch belt and still only making 20 knots. But well armed and a very fair armored cruiser. I mean, the armored cruiser designs so far that we've seen here are pretty standardized and mostly pretty effective, I would say. I skipped Japan. Japan has 14 armored cruisers. Everybody has a pretty similar number except Germany. 14 armored cruisers Japan has. Now, Izumo here, the oldest, is a New York clone and is basically useless. After that, they built Asama and the Iwate, which are your pretty typical 7-inch armed cruiser. I'm being a little harshly prejudiced against them. 7 inches. Let's check the research data here. 7 inches penetrates 4.7-inch belt at 1,000 yards. 3.1 at 5,000 yards and ranges out to about 9,000 yards. So that's 4.7, 3.1, and 9,000. This penetrates 5.1, 3.5. It also reaches about 9,000. So The 8-inch guns really only give you a half an inch extra of penetration, if that. They give you more explosive power as well, of course, and that's not even linear. That's more or less exponential over time or something like that. 15, because it expands in multiple directions. Like a 15-inch shell is much, much, much more than triple a 5-inch shell. But in any case, for a 7-inch cruiser design, not bad at all, I would say. Pretty standard. Then Azuma and Tokiwa, which are. Now, these are small 7-inch cruisers with only two 7-inch guns, six 5-inch, and at only 19 knots and a 3.5-inch belt. These are very budget armored cruisers. They're not very good. But then they built Kasuga, Nishin, Yakumo, and Furutaka, which these, you know, I really think just slap twin turrets on if you're going to have a big main armament like that. But the two 8-inch guns is good. 12 6-inch, 12 3-inch. It's pretty well armed. 18 knots is pretty alarmingly slow. Like, there's battleships that are almost that fast. We have some 17-knot battleships, but and it'll have real trouble catching any other cruiser out there. But in a fight, it should do well enough. Then the Aso, Kako, and Kinugasu, which are marginally heavier. They do have the twin turrets, and they make 20 knots. Bit of a lighter secondary armament. All around, I'd probably rather have these than the Kasugas, because that extra 2 knots is worth a lot. And for what they lose in secondary armament, the extra 2 bigger guns probably makes up for, maybe not. These are a little lighter armored, but that, or a little bit lighter armed overall, but that 2 knots is worth a lot for a cruiser. Then they built Mayoko and Ashigara more recently. This is their most recent class, and these I see are a Memphis type with 6 8-inch guns. And to be fair, it's lighter than a Memphis by 1,400 tons, but it is a bit of only 14 5-inch guns and 10 2-inch guns for is a definitely lighter secondary armament. And it is slower at 20 knots, so not bad at all, but definitely inferior to a Memphis. Now, Italy has 15 armored cruisers, but they're a little bit lighter than the average. They're certainly lighter than Britain's average, maybe not lighter than the overall average. Italy has Vettor Pisani. Dang, Italy only started with 1, too. The AI has been building these like just madman. Vettor Pisani, Carlo Alberto, and Giuseppe Garibaldi, which is one of their pre-gen classes, and this is a pretty standard 2 8-inch guns, 8 6-inch, 12 3-inch, 21 knots, 4-inch belt. Not a bad armored cruiser at all, nothing enormously special. They followed it up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Amerigo Vespucci class armored cruisers, which are. Well, we've seen basically, or maybe exactly this design before. This is the budget armored cruiser with just 7-inch and 5-inch guns. Only makes 20 knots, at least not disastrous, but not great, and 3.5-inch belt where they skimped half an inch of belt armor. These are good for making up the numbers, and if you're on a budget, but they're not that good overall. Most other armored cruisers would beat them. But more recently, they have stepped it up again with the Montebello and Etna, which are big 7,600 tonners. And they've got the Memphis type 6 8-inch gun arrangement, but still only the 5-inch and 2-inch secondaries. Still pretty dangerous, but that secondary step down from 6 to 5 inches is pretty considerable, actually, so not as good as it could have been. And then most recently, for 200 tons extra, they've built Solferino and Stromboli, which these are interesting, actually. 4 8-inch guns in the 2 twin turrets, 8 6-inch, 12 3-inch, 21 knots, 3.5-inch belt. They're not the biggest and most powerful armored cruisers anywhere, but they're not bad anywhere either. The main armament is good. The secondary armament is decent. The speed is good. The armor is a little skimpy, but not bad. That half inch isn't a huge difference. I like those two. Okay, now Russia, interestingly, has cheaped out on its armored cruisers. It actually has the second smallest force in the world, with 12 and a very light average. They have Pomyarazova and Rossiya as their oldest ones, and these are New York clones. Pretty useless. Now, to be fair, being hard on Russia there, we sank. It'll show here, actually. We sank two Varyag class armored cruisers in our war with them in the last. How long ago was it? 2 years ago? A year and a half ago? I've been talking too long straight. Sorry, folks. Okay, yeah, we sank. Let me readjust. We sank two of those in our war with them a year and a half ago, and these were some of their best, so that's part of the reason that they're down a bit in terms of their armored cruiser force. Plus, Japan sank two Bogatyrs in their simultaneous but separate war with them, so that's another reason they're down on these. They lost 4 armored cruisers all told in that war, which would have been, they'd have been up to 16 and quite a bit stronger. But that's what happens when you lose a war, I guess. But anyway, they have currently Varyag, Vityaz, and Oleg 3 Varyag class. They once had 5. These are pretty decent with, well, actually, they're kind of just mediocre in all respects. An extra 1,000 or 2,000 tons would have helped them a lot, but probably would have, cut 1 or 2 out of what they could produce. But, the single 8-inch turrets doubles would be doubling the firepower and not doubling the weight. 8 6-inch guns is a little skimpy. 4-inch belt is good, but 20 knots, not terrible, but not that fast. I mean, all of our armored cruisers do at least 21. The Memphis I pushed to 22, which I'm seeing is... Honestly, so far I haven't actually seen anything that I consider clear-cut better than the Memphis. Now, at 9,000 tons, it's an expensive armored cruiser, which is usually how my designs go. I'm not going to build cheap ships for the most part unless I really have a reason to, or just for, like, escort duties, but maybe, but... I find it's usually worth it. You might have to run from some battles where you're badly outnumbered, but when you do get one where you're close to even, you'll almost always win. And that battle that we won against Russia, we were significantly outnumbered and made it work anyway, in part because of our better ships. But anyway, so the Varyags, I mean, you can see some of the deficiencies. They're a little on the small side for an armored cruiser. They're just a little cheaped out on a lot of areas. And then the Bokatyr class, Latnik, Voin, and Polkon, once they also had 5 of these, now 3. These are just sort of a marginal upgrade on the Varyag. I mean, I think the only real difference, 2, 8, 8, 6, 12, 3... Yeah, the only difference I see, there might also be some internal differences, but the only difference I see is that they've stuck 2 extra 6-inch guns onto the Bogatyr class at the cost of 700 tons of weight, which probably means there's some internal changes as well, but in terms of fighting power, that's actually a fair bit of extra cost for not too much of a firepower increase, really, proportionally. I'm not sure it's worth it. Then more recently, also pre-war to be fair, but recently they've built the Peresvet and the Rayurik, which are really cheaping out on 18 knots, 3.5-inch belt, and only 7 and 5-inch main guns. Not very good at all. Yeah, the Varyag and Bogatyr are actually still the best out of their armored cruisers, despite being not that great. And then immediately around in post-war, they've built Askold and Kinyaginya Olga, which are 6,300 tons, 2 8-inch, 8 6-inch, 12 3-inch, 21 knots, 3.5-inch belts. So, okay, compared to the Varyag here, 2 8, 8 6, 12 3, same armament, 1 knot faster, but half an inch less of belt armor is the only difference that I can see, actually. Actually, I can see the ship histories of the AI, too. Didn't actually know that. Not that it's very informative. They're just moving their ships constantly all over the place, way more than the player ever would. But I can't see like the combat here. Like this old egg here took heavy damage from Salt Lake City, Raleigh, and Baltimore. Hit Baltimore once, survived. That's interesting. Anyway, so yeah, the Russian armored cruiser fleet is a bit of a shambles. Honestly, it already was like none over 6,800 tons coming into the war with us, but having lost four of their best two classes, well, the Oscolds are basically the same, little faster, little less armored, but having lost four of their best classes, they're really in a bit of a state now. And then Germany. Germany has 21 armored cruisers, which by numbers and tonnage is the largest in the world. Although you notice their average tonnage is definitely going to be less than Britain's 16, but it's a lot of armored cruisers. So they have Victoria Luise, Hertha, and Hansa, their oldest three. And now these are pretty solid. 4 8-inch guns, 8 6-inch guns, 12 3-inch guns, 20 knots, 4-inch belt. I would almost call this just the flat out, like, default armored cruiser design against which all others are judged. They are unremarkable in pretty much every way and quite solid. I mean, no obvious weaknesses. They followed those up with Freya, Veneta, Prince Heinrich, Fürst Bismarck, and Friedrich Karl. 5 of these Freyas. These are all New York clones. They all suck. So that's a big check mark against them. More recently, they built Prince Adalbert and York, and these are much bigger. These are 8,300 tons. They have a Memphis-style 6 8-inch gun layout. They make 22 knots like a Memphis. However, they did skimp that half-inch of belt armor, and they have lighter secondaries. Still, I like these. It's hard to say whether 700 more tons to be equal to a Memphis would have been enough to put 6-inch guns here instead and 3-inch, because that would be a big difference in firepower. But as it stands, these are good, but just clearly inferior to our Memphis class. But they'd have a good chance against our Pittsburgh class, which they should for the tonnage. Then they built a lone Blucher, which is, well, sort of a straight downgrade in terms of, I mean, I think the main difference is they stripped out both of the side 8-inch. Well, no, okay. Yeah, compare it more to like the Victoria Luise class, which is what it's really a skimped out version of. It's just lost the twin turrets, the twin 8-inch turrets for single 8-inch turrets, and it's gained a knot of speed. And it's 700 tons less, so it's not bad. But I much prefer having the actual, 4 big guns on an armored cruiser. Interesting, the Germans aren't skimping out on gun sizes much, at least for these. Then they built 6 Rune-class cruisers: Rune, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Undine, and Berlin, and München. That is 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, and München. These are, again, a 2 8-inch, 10 6-inch. These are... How do these even differ from Blucher? Well, compared to Blucher, these have an extra... Well, actually, interesting. They have an extra 2 secondary 6-inch guns, but they're not slower and have half an inch less of armor, and they're 200 tons more. So I'm not sure why these seem to be so much less optimized. There might be other issues like freeboard or range, but as combat units for price, I wouldn't say they're any better at all than Blucher, probably worse. Then they built 3 Hamburgs: Hamburg, Lübeck, and Danzig. And these are definitely the light, cheap-out type of armored cruiser with the 7 and 5-inch guns. 20 knots, I mean, I've seen some that had like 18, so that's not so bad. 3.5-inch belt. They're just not that great. And right now, they've just finished Königsberg and are building her 2 sisters. This is... With 2 8-inch guns, 12 6-inch, only a 3-inch belt, but it does make 21 knots. I mean, I would say Well, it's a step in a different direction anyway. It's got a relatively heavy secondary armament, not such a heavy main armament, although at least it's still 8-inch guns. Relatively thin armor, but high speed. I mean, it's sort of the opposite of the direction that they were going with these Prince Adalberts, which I'd say are still their most dangerous units. So that's interesting. It's a pretty, I mean, it's a very numerous fleet, and it's pretty powerful. Most of their units are quite good, except these 5 Freyas, which are worthless, but, you know, we've all got some Freyas, New Yorks, etc. Now, France and Britain have 16 each, but Britain's are definitely heavier on average. France first, they have Dupuy de Lome and Amiral Scharner, both pre-built, of the Memphis type even. 21 knots, 6 8-inch guns, 12 5-inch, 10 2-inch, 4-inch belt. I mean, really not bad. The main issue is going to be the light secondary armament with no cruiser-grade secondary guns, but not bad. 7,600 tons, of course, but I mean, mine are heavier than that, all my new designs, so I don't hate it. Then Chanzy, Bruy, Latouche Treville, Guidon, and Janda d'Arc. 5 of these Chanzy class. 4 8-inch, 8 6-inch, 12. Okay, I mentioned these with Germany. These are the bog standard default armored cruiser in effect. Then they built Montcalm, Duplay, and Dessay. And these are 8,300 ton Memphis types, 21 knots, 3.5-inch belt. They are again the Memphis type that sort of skimps out a little bit with the lower secondaries and the thinner belt. In fact, compared to the original Dupuy de Lumes here, I don't know how 8 6 12 5 10 2 21 knots 4-inch belt. Point of fact, I'm not at all clear on why they're 700 tons heavier than this class while having half an inch less of belt armor. I can only assume that to make this work, these have short range or something, but so maybe the Montcalms are better as functional units, but if they are, that means the Dupuy de Lumes have some sort of flaw, and these have half an inch less of belt armor. So I'm not convinced. Then they built 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Poteau class. Poteau du Petit Tours, Kleber, Gloire, and Sully. Now these have twin 8-inch guns, 12 6s, 12 3s, 3.5-inch belt, 20 knots. The 8-inch guns and the armament is good, but speed and armor are both fairly unimpressive on these. They're pretty good cruisers, though. I mean, actually, not bad. If you could get up to twin 8-inch guns, I'd probably build I mean, I really wonder how much extra tonnage it would actually take to have twin 8-inch guns and that extra half-inch of belt armor. And if it was like 7,000 or less, then that would probably be just straightforwardly better for your money. And most recently, they've built Combe, which is half of that. They've added the twin guns and even more secondaries, 14 6-inchers. But they haven't increased the speed. It's still 20 knots, and they've stripped another half-inch of belt armor out in order to make that fit on 6,800 tons. So it's very well armed, actually, or without being a Memphis type, as well armed as any, but speed on impressive, armor really pretty light for an armored cruiser, so I'm not sure I love it. And finally, Great Britain. They have 16 armored cruisers, heavy armored cruisers on average, probably the heaviest out of anybody in the world, which was the same with their light cruisers too. Their older ones, well, they have a one-off here, Drake, which has, this is the, well, yeah, this is a pretty standard armored cruiser design, 4 8s, 8 6s, 12 3s, 20 knots, 4-inch belt. I think they've managed to build it on less this, no, they've actually had 400 tons more displacement than most people do. It might have long range or something. Pretty solid cruiser, though. And then they followed that with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Hogue class. Hogue, Bacante, Leviathan, Monmouth, Bedford, King Alfred, and Kent. Which by comparison are a knot faster and have an extra 2 6-inch guns, but lose half an inch of belt armor. However, for that not faster, extra two guns, and half-inch less of belt armor, they're 400 tons lighter and presumably cheaper, which means they're actually a pretty good serial production design, I would say. Not bad at all. Then they built 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Essex class: Essex, Berwick, Cornwall, Donegal, and Cumberland. And, they've even kept the naming kind of. I don't know if the game actually accounts for that, but these are all actually counties or regions of England, which means they've kept the naming scheme consistent throughout the class. I don't know if the game is capable of accounting for that or not, but if so, it's kind of good or impressive. Anyway, these are 8,400 tons. Memphis, sort of the cheap Memphis type. They do make 21 knots, but they've got the half-inch less of armor. They've got the weak secondaries. They're still pretty powerful with those 6-inch guns. When I say cheap Essex, they're very expensive ships still. Or cheap Memphis, they're still very expensive ships. Then they've got the 3 6,800 ton Suffolk, Antrim, and Hampshire. And these are your sort of modern 8-inch armored cruiser with the 14 6-inch and the 12 3-inch guns. 20 knots, 4-inch belt. I mean, there's no flaws with these. They're just basically very standard armored cruisers and probably a couple extra guns compared to some of the other standard ones, if I'm not mistaken, because they're more modern. So I like those. And they're building, okay, they are building, I can't see the details of it yet, but they're building right now a beast HMS Devonshire, which is going to clock in at 12,400 tons. I'll have to take a look at that in the campaign proper because that's going to be a mighty armored cruiser. Now, having looked through all that, you will notice even the prides of their armored cruiser force, the 8,400-ton Essexes, smaller than all of these 9,100-ton diadems. And less well-armored. I don't know why these are considered. I mean, the only reason these are considered light cruisers is because they don't have any guns over 6-inch. I have no idea how the Brits finagled the game into considering these things light cruisers, because this right here is simultaneously the best light cruiser and also the best armored cruiser in the game. I don't know how the game has decided, why the game has interpreted them as light cruisers when they're extremely large and powerful armored cruisers, but that's how it is. So that finally brings us on to what maybe you've been waiting for, the battleships. There are actually more of those than there are either type of cruiser in the world, albeit more cruisers put together than battleships. But now, the big three, well, Britain really dominates the battleship game. Not as much as it dominates the light cruiser game, but certainly dominates the battleship game. Did I say battle cruiser once or twice? I might have. Sorry. Now, the U.S. has two of these small leftover battleships, Michigan and Delaware. These are bad, to be honest. They don't really have any redeeming factors. I would call them coastal battleships. 7,200 tons. I guess that's the redeeming factor. They're cheap. But they only make 13 knots. A 10-inch belt is actually better than a lot of the battleship designs I've seen floating around, but I still don't really consider it enough. The 4 12-inch guns are good, because that's what a battleship should have in the pre-Dreadnought era, traditionally. At least, 4 large caliber guns. If they're 11-inch, anywhere up to 13 or 13.5-inch, that's typical. There are a few real-life experimental designs with either less or more than that. There were a couple of 16-inch armed Italian battleships floating around in the 1890s, but very short barrels and probably prone to breaking themselves when they shot, so not great. Anyway, the issue with this, of course, is low speed, mediocre armor, no secondary armament worth mentioning, just too small and too slow to be a real line battleship. The core of the American battle fleet is Oklahoma, North Dakota, Montana, and Illinois. 4 battleships of 14,300 tons. I pushed them up to 17 knots, which was probably ultimately a mistake. We should have just settled for 16 because that's what the new class is going to make, and it's what pretty much everybody else makes. Well, that's not true. The Brits have built a lot with 17 knots, so the Germans have some at 18. So maybe I should have kept them at 17 actually. But with the new ones at 16, it's unnecessary now anyway. But good 12-inch belt and 2-inch deck. That's a lot for this era. I believe all of the measurements are. It's unclear. I'm gonna say basically all the measurements are probably in equivalent crop inches or something because they should be a lot thicker than that in the early 1890s and then get rapidly thinner throughout the decade as crop is invented and things right before it, Harvey. But that's not really reflected in game. So you can see, I mean, 12 inches even now, completely invulnerable to its own guns. I mean, nothing can really penetrate 12 inches of armor yet, but it's a little bit of sort of future proofing because we're not going to get rid of them instantly. And once somebody invents like a zero quality 1905 12-inch gun, it's going to have a good chance of penetrating 12-inch armor. But realistically, we're still going to have the Oklahomas then, and until 1910 or 1915 or whenever we can get enough dreadnoughts to replace them. Same with the 2 inches of deck armor, realistically, because nothing can penetrate that either. But on the other hand, that's a good thing to have an invincible battleship, because some of the battleships floating around that have 6 or 7 inches of armor, we're just gonna rip apart eventually, with almost total impunity. Anyway, a 4 12-inch gun main battery, 10 5s and 14 3s is pretty light on secondary guns for a battleship, especially for this era, but sort of the necessary compromise for the amount of armor and speed that I've got into them. And it's still a lot better than the Michigans, plus the heavy main guns. These are not technically ready in 1900, but we'll take a look at the Arizona class. Only 700 tons heavier at 15,000 tons. Same armor, a not less of speed, but much heavier secondary armament of 12 7-inch guns rather than 10 5s. Plus, we've gotten it up to 18 3-inch guns. This is much more like a proper late pre-dreadnought with a really heavy secondary armament. I wouldn't quite call it a semi-dreadnought yet, but I would say 9 or 10-inch guns maybe for a semi-dreadnought. But this is getting there with that really heavy secondary armament. I mean, that's a whole, that secondary armament is already more powerful than any cruiser around. So then our rivals, our fleet is not big, although we do have more. No, I'm looking at armored cruisers. Yeah, we're only larger than Spain, Austria, Hungary, and Japan. To be fair, we do have, well, also this is counting under construction battleships in this tonnage, so that's once the Arizonas are finished. With them unfinished, we probably have more like 85 or something. So we have marginally more than Japan, Spain, and Austria-Hungary. We're about to have a good deal more, but still way less than the Big Five. But anyway, Spain, smallest battleship fleet in the world here. They had originally Fernando VII and Alejandro I as their carryover battleships, and these are better than our carryover battleship, the Michigans, to be fair. 10,000 tons, 16-knot top speed, a ridiculous 16-inch belt. They will have the worst possible armor quality in the game. I've seen some unlocks for that, but I don't think that the difference is as radical as it was historically. Now they have this weird. They have two 12-inch guns in single turrets, and then two 11-inch guns in side turrets, plus 12 5-inch guns. I mean, I would much rather have four 12-inch guns and two twin turrets. That would be just a considerable upgrade. But it's not. I mean, effectively, if they have a 3-gun broadside, and one of them is an 11-inch gun, so it's definitely worse than 412s, but not so much worse. And they will be harder to disable. I don't love it, but I mean, especially with that really thick armor, it's not terrible. Now, I do think they're clearly better, ironically enough, than the 5-ship Velasco class that they built after the game started. Velasco, Numancia I, Rey Don Francisco de Assis, Real Familia, and Reina Dona Isabel II. These only have, they're 10,000 tons, same, but they're not slower. They have the same massive armor belt. And I'm pretty sure that for whatever reason, 12 fives, what they've done is taken off the two 12-inch guns, okay, they've taken off the 11-inch guns on the side, replaced the 12-inch guns with 11-inch guns in single turrets, and then they've stuck 6-inch guns on there. But I would much rather have the extra two really big battleship caliber guns than the 6-inch guns. I think, and the knot of speed less. I'm not sure quite what factors led to it being so. Maybe there's some other internal stuff like range, but I would call the Velascos clearly inferior for most combat purposes than Fernando VII, unless there's a big issue like low freeboard with these, maybe. And to be fair, they did build them all overseas. These were built in Germany. The last ones were built in Britain. I don't like any of the Spanish battleships. I mean, they're mostly better than our Michigan class, although they all have less firepower at long range than our Michigan class, but they would win in a fight thanks to their belt armor, I think. But our Oklahoma class would already, honestly, probably shred these. I don't even know how exactly it would work since neither of them can actually penetrate the other's armor. But I would assume high explosive shells and the like would eventually disable the Spanish battleships based on just above armor damage. And the armor belts on these early ships especially are not the whole ship long, so you would do significant damage to everything the armor didn't cover. And I think we would win that fight. Yeah. Now, Japan's battleship fleet is now heavier than Spain's, although they only have 6 battleships, same as us to be fair, but we're building more. They do have these two things, Yashima and Fuso, and they lost. Well, that's interesting, actually. Yashima and Fuji, okay. They originally had 3 of these. They lost one in their battle with Russia, but that doesn't count for much because, yeah, as you can see, as I've commented several times on seeing them in the campaign, these are not battleships. This is a 3,300-ton gunboat or monitor or some such. It makes 12 knots. It has 6 inches of armor. It does have 6 9-inch guns and 6 3-inch guns. At the very start of the campaign, it might have been more viable than you would think because a lot of stuff would have had a lot of trouble penetrating a 6-inch belt. By now, when actual battleship caliber and even armored cruiser caliber guns should be able to penetrate that at least close range, it's pretty much useless because of how slow it is, because it's classed as a battleship and against any other battleship it will get annihilated. Because any cruiser that it could actually sink with those 9-inch guns can easily outrun it. It's not good. I mean, it's really more of like a bombardment type ship than an actual ship versus ship combat unit. Now, to make up for that, they have built Shikishima, Iwami, and Asahi, and these are splendid combat units. These Shikishima, well, okay. What these are battle cruisers. Japan has somehow contrived to build battle cruisers before the invention of turbine engines or just battle cruisers in general. And there are some glaring flaws as a result, but there's also some very impressive things. Okay, they make 19 knots. That's faster than any other battleship I've seen. They've got the 4 12-inch guns. They've got 12 7-inch guns. They've got 23-inch guns, which means that by the margin of 2 3-inch guns, they outgun even our new Arizona class very slightly, and they're 3 knots faster. However, the glaring flaw, 6.5 inches of belt armor. That's battlecruiser grade belt armor. And they kind of lack the one big advantage that battlecruisers really did have, which is that they were as fast as most of the cruisers of their time, at least the heavy cruisers, These are as fast as some of them, but they're marginally slower still than most of the existing armored and the also light cruisers in existence. So I'm not entirely sure where they fit in. I mean, and to be fair, that was always sort of the problem with battle cruisers too, but at least battle cruisers should have been able to run down and destroy armored cruisers and light cruisers. These really can't, and although they're very heavily armed, that very thin belt should still see them lose to most. I mean, I think that our Arizona class would cleanly beat them in a fight because of the having nearly double the armor belt. These aren't going to have the staying power of a lot of other battleships out there. They've also built most recently Mikasa, which is pretty much doubling down. I mean, it's just slightly different take on the concept. It's got no 7-inch guns, instead it's got 14 6-inch guns. It's 500 tons lighter. It loses a knot of speed, which is the main thing it's got going for it. And it's still got a 6.5-inch belt. So this is probably worse than Shikishima, to tell you the truth. And the flaws are maybe more glaring on it, honestly. They are also building Iki, which will be their largest battleship yet, in Germany. Now, Austria-Hungary has 13 battleships, which is up there with the big powers. But as you can see from the tonnages, they're, well, yeah. They're actually not that light, a 13 battleship. Oh, I'm looking at the armored cruisers again. Why do I keep doing this? To be fair, 13, 13. Yeah, they do have 13 battleships, which is sort of up there in numbers. It's less than the big powers, but not that much less. But as you can see, compared to Italy's 16, much less tonnage. Austria-Hungary has gone with the coastal approach to battleships, to be fair, which is valid for a power that's fighting entirely in the Adriatic. They have Wien, Kaiser, and Monarch, which are 5,100-ton battleships with three 12-inch guns in this weird layout where... Which way is which? I think this is the bow on most designs. No. The right side is the bow on most designs. Oh, no, I guess it's the left. Yeah. Okay. It can actually be kind of hard to... Yeah, it's definitely the left. It can be kind of hard to tell on some designs, actually. So they've gone with this weird layout where they have two, not a twin turret, but side-by-side single 12-inch turrets at the bow, and one more 12-inch turret aft, plus 6 6-inch and 10 2-inch guns. It makes 16 knots. It's got a 9-inch armor belt, which is mediocre, not terrible. And it's very light and probably cheap for a battleship, which is why they have so many. The glaring flaw is that it's only going to have two 12-inch guns that can actually bear on anything that's off to its side, unless it can get at an angle like... maybe this way-ish? I'm not sure any angle exists where it can bring all three 12-inch guns to bear on a single target, which means in a real gunnery engagement, it's going to be outgunned by most of the battleships out there. However, it's very light and cheap compared to them, so I honestly think with 16 knots of speed that it's not that bad. They followed that up, because apparently they agreed it wasn't that bad, with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Radetzky-class battleships. Radetzky, Zriny, Habsburg, Babenberg, Erzherzog Franz Ferdinand, Erzherzog Karl, and Erzherzog Friedrich. Now these have the same idea, but ruin it. Okay, because these have two 11-inch guns just at the bow in side-by-side turrets, 8 7-inch guns and 10 2-inch guns. So, to be fair, with that number of secondaries, which is what they've gotten out of stripping that much primary gunnery out, 9-inch belt still, It's pretty good at area denial, maybe, against cruisers at least. Against cruisers, it'll be pretty good at area denial. It will be smashed by most battleships, but it's also a half to a third the tonnage and probably price of most battleships. It only makes 12 knots, which is a big downgrade from 16 knots. I think that the Rudetskis are quite considerably worse than the Veens. I think that 16 knots of speed was actually really important to being able to maybe actually bring these useless guns to bear, because you know what's going to happen with 12 knots? I mean, these things had better have a good turning circle, or what, it can bear maybe to like here and here. There's a big blind arc, like a good, 120 degrees here that neither of the main guns can bear on at all, which is a problem. And especially a problem when your ship only makes 12 knots. Now, maybe it's maneuverable enough to keep itself bearing at all times, but if it isn't, it could very easily find itself pretty helpless to respond to anything behind it. And pretty much everything is going to be able to outrun it if it doesn't want to fight it, so it's more of a port defense ship, like a mobile coastal battery, than anything. It's at least well enough armored to do that job, but I don't like them at all. And then following on from those, they've so far built 3 Tegetthoffs, Tegetthoff, Budapest, and Arpad. They're building a 4th. These are... looks like they're going back towards the Veen design again after unsuccessful experiment. Yeah. These have 3 12-inch guns compared to the Veens. Same layout and all. They have an extra 4 6-inch guns. 16 knots, 9-inch belt. I mean, to tell you the truth, that's about it. They have an extra 4 6-inch guns compared to the Veens, and otherwise they're pretty much the same. They have newer and what looks like probably longer 12-inch guns, so that's an improvement. And they weigh an extra 1,100 tons. I don't know if that was really the cost for 4 6-inch guns, or if they, which it might be. It really might be. Or if maybe they have better freeboard or something, but I mean, these are currently the final evolution of this design line for Austria. I should hope they won't try to take these beyond the pre-Dreadnought era, because Dreadnoughts are really going to take these to pieces. As it is, for Austria-Hungary's purposes, I hate these a little less than you would think, but they're still not good. I mean, let's put it this way. If you get these out in a line of battle against an equal number of normal battleships, or maybe even against half their number of normal battleships, they'll probably lose. But in a tangled, like, port or island environment in really confined seas, um, they might be able to do a lot of damage if they stumbled upon a raiding cruiser force or something, or even a couple of isolated battleships. I mean, there's a lot of them, which is traditionally, there's a lot of them is not the primary attribute of battleships compared to other ships, but for Austria-Hungary, it might work here. We'll see. Well, we probably won't see directly because we're not going to fight them in any of my plans, but to be fair, they did fight that one war with Italy, and they came out all right, so far as I can tell. They lost a Veen-class battleship, the Budapest, but they sank an armored cruiser that was actually larger than that battleship, and a light cruiser that was also larger than that battleship, so they also lost a light cruiser that was larger than that battleship. It's so weird having battleships this small, but I mean, I would call them more of coast defense ships, and they really might serve that role as coast defense ships pretty well. I definitely wouldn't want to take them beyond the Adriatic, though. Right, and then Italy, Austria-Hungary's natural enemy, really. Only 3 more battleships, but about 3 times the tonnage. Their earlier ones are the 5 Caiodulios. Caio Andrea Doria, Ruggiero de Loria, Francesco Morosini, and Italia. Now these have 4 13-inch guns, 8 6-inch, 16 2-inch. They make 18 knots, which is fast for a battleship, and they're 11,000 tons, which is not that heavy, but decent. However, they only have a 6-inch armor belt, which is awfully thin for a battleship, really. I mean, that's again down into battle cruiser range. Now, in 1890, very little could penetrate that, but by 1900, some stuff can penetrate that. Um, However, they're not terrible. The four 13-inch guns are certainly interesting. The secondary armament is a little light, but I can't really talk because that on my battleships is too. And they're a lot lighter than, probably cheaper than my battleships. That armor is going to be the big issue, and it would have been less of an issue when they were built, but it's more and more of an issue now for sure. They don't really get a detailed history for their. Oh man, they don't really get a detailed history for their war with Italy or with Austria-Hungary. Apparently, in the middle of those, for whatever reason, they built Enrico Dandolo here, which is just, oh my god. Okay, I was complaining about the Japanese battleships that are really monitors and the Austrian battleships that are really coast defense ships, but this is an atrocity. This battleship is so bad. Wow. I don't think I've seen this one before. Okay, so this has four 13-inch guns, but for some just absolutely ungodly reason, they've placed them in like crossfire turret positions on the sides of the ship so that you really got to be at a very precise, almost 90-degree angle to your target in order to actually bring all four to bear, or otherwise you're only going to have two. And it gets more complicated to balance your ship when you're doing this, as opposed to just putting them fore and aft like a sensible person. The only reason to do this sort of layout traditionally is with like early dreadnoughts where there's not enough space for 4 or 5 centerline turrets. But they do not have that excuse with these. This is just a really bad layout for those guns. They literally have a 6-inch gun each where these turrets really should be. Plus 4 5-inch guns. Very light secondary armament, too. Only makes 16 knots is not bad, but it's less than the other ones. 14-inch belt is very good, to be fair. Quite strong, but does not make up for this abysmal armament. This battleship is almost like combat ineffective. Its armament is so bad. I would say, 75% of the time, it's only going to have two 13-inch guns in effective action, plus a couple of secondaries. Even when it gets all four in, any decent maneuvering, and it's just going to lose them again. This is not good. This is really actually probably the worst. That is an auto-generated design, too. This is bad. I don't know what to say about that one, really, except that it's bad. After the game started, they built Sicilia, which is 10,700 tons, 4 12-inch guns, 10 7-inch guns, 16 2-inch guns. 14 knots and 10,700 tons makes it a little on the. It's definitely on the slow side. It's really quite slow, and thinly armored at 8.5-inch belt. But the armament is decent, so it's not terrible. This is going to be one of those battleships that, when it was built, was actually quite decent because the speed doesn't matter that much. Well, it was going to struggle to keep up with the line of battle even when it was built, but if it can get to the battle, then the speed won't matter that much because it's a battleship. And that armor was still more than good enough to deflect almost everything, and the armament was good. But by 1900, it's really already starting to show its age as you get more and more battleships that are, almost everything new built is at least 16 knots, if not better. And that armor is getting perilously close to where most any heavy gun will penetrate it. The armament is still good, but it's no longer enough to make up for these two issues. Then they followed that with Sardinia, Lepanto, and Re Umberto, which are battle cruisers, very much like the Japanese ones. 412s, 86s, 19 knots, but only a 6.5-inch belt. Battle cruiser type pre-dreadnought. Really a strange choice for my money. I mean, the speed will help them longevity-wise, but arguably it really won't because this armor is so thin. And the problem is in another, within 10 years, they're going to be at risk of coming up against actual battle cruisers, which will have as much armor and be, 4 to 5 knots faster and have twice the armament. And then they're going to die. So, at least a pre-dreadnought, a good pre-dreadnought with a lot of armor and a heavy secondary battery actually has a fighting chance against a battle cruiser is the thing. Like if these Arizonas come up against, an early invincible type battle cruiser that has, maybe 8 12-inch guns, but they're in kind of a bad configuration. If the Arizona's been updated with modern fire control and such, then having double the belt armor thickness and this really powerful secondary battery actually stands a fighting chance, at least, against a battle cruiser. Really, in a slugging match. I wouldn't recommend it, but stands a fighting chance much more than something like this with this really thin belt does. And lighter secondaries. They followed that up with no less than 6 of the Regina Margaritas. Regina Margarita, Emanuela Filiberto, Benedetto Brin, Amaraglio St. Paul, Regina Elena, and Napoli. Now these have... Okay, these make 12,400 tons, 17 knots, 4 12-inch guns, 8 7-inch guns, 8 4-inch guns, 11.5-inch belt. I actually like this class. It's well balanced. In terms of numbers, its secondary armament are a little thin, but calibers are good. Armor is quite solid still, just slightly less than my battleships have. Speed is good. I'm fairly impressed by this class, as a matter of fact. I wonder if at 13,500 tons you could build it with a 12-inch belt and like 2 more each of secondary and tertiaries, and I would really love it, but it's quite a nice class, I think. These are good. And they'll certainly, they'll make mincemeat of those Austrian things I was talking about. Well, yeah, yes and no. To a lesser extent than you'd think, but yes. I don't know if every one of these is worth 2 of those Austro-Hungarian coastal defense ships, though. But they don't really have to be, because Italy's budget is so much bigger that they actually outnumber them anyway. But and then they're building 5 Vittorio Emanuele class, but those are not finished yet, so we can't really judge them. Currently, these are the state-of-the-art in Italy, and, they're not bad at all. My new Arizonas will beat them, but those aren't finished yet, nor are their new class, so that's you can't fairly judge them. So then for... we've done these 4, so Russia. Russia has 19 battleships, so we are really entering the big leagues here. Russia's fleet is very comparable to Germany and France's, only marginally inferior. Obviously, Britain in a league of its own. 19 battleships the Russians have. Now, a big chunk of those, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, are the Prvenets class. Prvenets, Imperator Peter Veliki, Imperator Nikolai I, Cesarevich Evstafi, Retvizan, Imperator Pavel I, Dvenedstadt Apostolov, and Dvenedstadt Apostolov. Now, these are quite questionable. These are very close to, like, our Michigan, which means bad. Yes, they have 4 12-inch guns, which is good, but 14 knots, 7-inch belt, light secondary and tertiary armament, small displacement, so it can't absorb that much damage necessarily. This is not a waste of 8 battleships, because they're still pretty powerful, ultimately. Probably could beat any cruiser, but... well, 2 out of our 6 battleships are not really battleships. I would say 8 out of 19 of the Russian battle fleet, basically a paper tiger here. These are not that good. However, it looks like they followed them with some much more capable classes. Imperator Alexander the... Okay, this is rebuilding. I can't actually see what it's called, but it's probably Imperator Alexander the First, maybe. Or I think, probably Imperator Alexander the First, unless it's the... For some reason, I want to say it's the third, but I might be making that up. And Pobeda, these are 10,300 tons. Okay, the obvious issue is that they only make 13 knots, which is awfully slow. But the 11-inch belt is good. The 4 12-inch guns, and even to some extent that secondary tertiary round is good. It's a little light on numbers, but not bad. The armament is at least adequate. The belt armor is good. The speed is the fatal flaw with this class, and it's a pretty big flaw. I mean, it's slow enough that it's going to be very noticeably left behind by the battle line of the rest of the Russian fleet in any significant engagement is the trouble. Which will lead to them being, well, okay, to be fair, not compared to these. We'll see, I guess, if they have any ships that are 16 knots, but then if they don't, the issue is that any fleet that does have 16-knot ships is going to heavily outmaneuver them in a battle. Which is actually largely what our cruisers did to the Russian cruisers in our big battle with them, so that's maybe an issue Russia has. They followed those with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 3... Oh boy. I'm so sorry for these Russian names. I mean, my French names are probably worse, but these are bad. 3 Sviatitelia class. The Sviatitelia, Imperator Alexander... Oh, there's 2 Imperator Alexanders. Oh, this is Imperator Alexander II. Gangut, Poltava, Petropavlovsk, and yet a 3rd Imperator Alexander. Okay, so there are possibly Imperator Alexander the First, Second, and Third in their fleet, which is a little much, really, but alright. Now, these are pretty balanced, okay? 12,000 tons, 15 knots, 12-inch belt, that's good. The armament is good. Okay, obviously, there is a very obvious problem with the armament, which is this layout. It's weird. This should be the bow, even though the ship is almost symmetrical, but I believe this is the bow on all the designs. So it has 2 side-by-side twin 12-inch turrets up front. It's not the very worst thing. Well, it's not the very worst thing in the world. I mean, you have to ask, in all honesty, would you have been better off on the same displacement ripping out one of those turrets and, say, upgrading all your secondaries to 7 or 8-inch guns, or giving yourself an extra knot or 2 of speed? You really might have been. The problem is, at the vast majority of angles, you're basically going to have 4 12-inch guns, same as most other battleships. This is not a good place to put a gun if you actually want it to be in action against an opponent on this side, ever, or vice versa. But at least you have a spare gun. I mean, if one of these gets knocked out, you can maybe switch sides, not if you're in a line of battle, but it could happen at some point. It can't literally hurt in combat, but in terms of a cost-effectiveness calculation, it can. It's definitely not optimal, but it's there. Okay. And they followed those with three of these Imperatrica Marias, Imperatrica Maria, Imperatrica Ekaterina Verakaya, and Imperatrica Elizaveta Petrovna. Now these, same displacement. This is the same ship. I mean, they're not... they are. 10.6, 10.2, 6.12, 12-inch belt, 15 knots. I don't know what the difference between the 3 Sviatitelia class and the Imperatrica Maria class is. It might be something internal. I mean, these were designed 5 years later, more or less. So there's probably, maybe these are short-ranged and these aren't or something. But there's no visible outwards difference to account for that 5 years of technological improvement. So, I mean, marks off for that because this design is just going to get more suboptimal over time, but it's basically the same. And then right now they're building two, their largest two battleships ever in France. So they're not building them themselves, but they're building them. But we can't see what's happened to those yet. Apparently they're behind schedule because this was supposed to be finished 1899 and isn't. But welcome to Russia. And now our three big powers. Germany, 21 battleships in service. Rapidly, German fleet is still moderately smaller than the French fleet at this moment, but only by 60,000 tons. They are catching up, for sure. It's actually hilarious that our budget is as big as France's and our tonnage is less than half. It is because our budget has been increasing very rapidly for the last decade, and our actual fleet size hasn't even come close to catching up to it, and also because I build bigger and more powerful ships than the average. And because I don't keep my fleet mothballed as much as the AI does. But I think the advantages of bigger and more powerful ships and of well-trained crews are worth something. We'll find out as the campaign goes on, I guess. Anyway, Germany. Germany has 21 battleships, just shy of 250,000 tons worth. The oldest four, Brandenburg, Wurth, Weissenberg, and Wittelsbach. So these are bad. I mean, no way around it. 14 knots, slow, 10-inch belt. I mean, far from the worst we've seen, but for trying to be a heavily armored battleship, not that heavy compared to the 11 or 12-inch belts. And then, well, the biggest issue is that the main armament is two 10-inch guns, which is honestly probably about a quarter, if I had to guess, of the actual throw weight of metal of four 12-inch guns. Now they also have four 9-inch guns, which helps make up for that, and eight 2-inch, but then eight 2-inch guns, so it's got no real secondaries other than the 9-inch guns. It just does not have enough of a main gun battery to really compete with most of the battleships we've seen. I mean, when the Germans are building guns, an inch or so smaller and as many of them-ish as the British, that's one thing. But this is not enough guns for a battleship, really. Sorry, Germany. They followed that up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Schwaben class. Schwaben, Wettin, Saarringen, Mecklenburg, Elsass, Braunschweig, and Preußen. These have exactly the same issues. So, well, okay, not all of them. These are fast, plenty fast at 18 knots. But they have less armor and a 9-inch belt, so the Germans aren't even getting their reputation for good armor. And four 9-inch guns, main battery, that's the main battery of a large armored cruiser, not a battleship. Flat out. Plus 14 6-inch guns, 10 2-inch guns. You know what the Germans have built here is the world's largest and best armored and armored cruiser. Not a battleship at all. It really is. It's quite fast for a battleship of this era, but it doesn't have battleship guns, and it doesn't really have battleship armor. I mean, close, but not really quite. Without big 12-inch guns, it just has no prayer. I mean, even 11 or 10-inch, I mean, it's got very little chance of penetrating the belt armor of any other battleship around. Even the ones with 6-inch belts it'll struggle with, probably, at this point. And the 9-inch belt is not thick enough to prevent other battleships with 12-inch guns from doing a lot of damage eventually. But it's fast enough to run away. It's a big armored cruiser. As I said, it's a big armored cruiser. The problem is Germany has 21 battleships. 7 of them being big armored cruisers is kind of an issue for them. Especially when these are useless also. They followed that with 6 Hessen class, the Hessen, Lothringen, Pommern, Deutschland, Hanover, and Schlesien. Okay, these are smaller, which isn't promising, but 10,500 tons, 16. Well, actually, I'm pleasantly relieved by these. Although they are smaller, they make 2 knots less at 16 knots, which is still very respectable. 12-inch belt, which is quite good. And praise be, they're back up to 4 11-inch guns, which is actually the armament Germany should be using. Maintaining your historical reputation for smaller than average guns is one thing, but you can only go so much smaller. This is the right amount of smaller. 8 7-inch guns and 8 3-inch guns is a light secondary armament, but these are actually a good, well-rounded battleship design, I would say. Not bad, Germany. And then they followed that with so far 4, and they're building 3 more Schleswig-Holsteins. The Schleswig-Holstein, Oldenburg, Nassau, and Posen. And these sort of go back to the same issues, actually, again, so they apparently learn nothing. They're 100 tons heavier than the Hessens, but they're back down to 10-inch guns, which is really bordering on just too little. I would say it still counts as a battleship, especially with the 11 inches of armor and only 17 knots of speed, but it's sort of trying to be like, well, it's a faster and lighter than average battleship. Marginally, an extra knot. If we say 16 knots is basically the standard. But the 10-inch guns are not going to cut it. Most battleships will still ultimately beat this because of those 10-inch guns. I would say, out of the whole damned German fleet, only these 6 Hessen-class battleships are really, really, really battleships in a certain sense. I mean, I barely can't, like, they've got, all their other battleships just have too small of guns. They really do. But then we'll see what France has concocted. They have 22 battleships. They're definitely heavier on average than Germany's. That's something. But something tells me they're all weird because they're French. Okay. Brennus, Charles Martel, and Carnot, the Brennus class of 3, their first design. And what did I tell you guys? Okay. 10,000 tons, 16 knots, 13-inch belt, really all quite respectable. They have 2 13-inch guns, which I will assume are the ones fore and aft, and 2 11-inch guns, port and starboard amidships, plus 12 5-inch guns, which is, light, but not that bad. I mean, the obvious issue is that it would surely both save weight and be more effective to rip out these 11-inch guns and put an extra 13-inch gun in each of these turrets. Why they haven't done that instead of installing these whole extra turrets here is beyond me. It does provide a certain amount of damage redundancy in the case that they get hit and lose a turret, but they're only going to bring their maximum at any one time. So that's 1 less than if you had 2 twin turrets. And they're different calibers, which is going to cause all sorts of confusion and logistical problems. I would stop short of saying it's bad, because it's not. The belt armor is good, the speed is good. Honestly, the firepower is better than a lot of battleships we've seen, but it is weird, and it's clearly not optimal. They followed that with Huaraguibri, which is the same design, except they've made it fast, and in doing so probably made it worse. Yeah. I mean, okay, it's got an extra 2 knots of speed. That's what it's got. It's lost 2 inches of belt armor for that. All of its main guns are 1 inch smaller, which is a pretty significant firepower loss. And it's lost 2/3 of its secondary armament. This, I actually still hesitate to say it's bad, because that belt is still pretty decent. Its speed is very good for a battleship. Its armament is not that bad. But its secondary armament is really bad. I mean, This would almost certainly lose to one of like our Oklahomas even in a slugging match, let alone our Arizonas. So it's not good. They followed that with three Brennus class, Bouvet, Messina, and Charlemagne. I don't know what happened to. Oh, three more Brennus class. Yes, I see. So they have six of these altogether. Oh, seven, because here's Gaulois. And then in between these seven Brennus, other than Huaragoibri, they built St. Louis, which is, or St. Louis in French, perhaps. 11,700 tons, 14 knots, 16-inch belt. That's a lot of belt. Okay, I see the obvious issue, but let me address it in a second. 12 5-inch, 12 2-inch, mediocre but solid secondary armament. They have 14-inch guns, which are the biggest I've seen on any battleship in the so far. They have three of them, all in individual single turrets. You know, I don't know if it's genius or just awful. It's definitely unusual. Obviously, it's slow. It's got to be pretty close to broadside on to bring the central 14-inch gun to bear. But I'm sure I've seen worse battleships. The belt armor is quite impressive. The secondaries aren't that bad. There is something to be said for big guns. I wouldn't build it. But you know, honestly, more power to the French for having done so. It might be terribly combat ineffective. I'm sure those are really bad 14-inch guns, but everybody's guns are really bad at this stage, so it's honestly hard to pass judgment on it for sure. It might be decent. At least it's smashing up other battleships. In a broadside engagement only, mind. And I'm not convinced. I wouldn't rather have 4 12s than 3 14s, but it's certainly interesting. However, they didn't go with that or with the Brennus. What they went with after that for their first post-start of game designs were 6 Henry IV class. Henry IV, Jena, Republic, Sovereign, Patrie, and Verity. Now these make 18 knots. They've got a 12-inch armor belt. Now the 13,700 tons, pretty big. Still smaller than ours. Okay, but the flaw is obvious. They have two 12-inch guns in single turrets. They have two 8-inch guns, which I don't really know where they are. If I had to guess, no, they can't be these, because each of these is a 6-inch turret. I don't know where the 8-inch guns are. I'm guessing they're on the sides somewhere and just haven't rendered properly. I feel like they are these because they're single-barreled, but then I don't know where the last 6-inch guns are. Oh, but that's already... maybe these are single-barreled too, and that's a shadow? Yeah. It's kind of hard for me to say for certain. Are they all single-barreled? But then in that case, it's all 6-inch guns. Okay, but they've got two 12-inch main guns, two 8-inch and 8 6-inch secondary guns. It's a decent secondary battery. They have no tertiary battery, so entirely dependent on the support of other ships or a really lucky shot to take out torpedo boats, which could be an issue. It's fast. It's well armored. Two 12-inch guns, it's half the firepower of the four 12-inch guns that's kind of standard. The secondaries are decent, but the total lack of tertiaries, and for it being really quite a big battleship, smaller than mine, but quite big, it's kind of problematic. I don't like this design very much at all, actually. No. You should really at least have twin 12-inch guns, even if it costs you a knot of speed or something. They followed those with the 5 Liberté class. Liberté, Justice, Danton, Diderot, and Democratie, which appear to be basically a more powerful refinement of the design. And to be fair, on the same tonnage, they've actually kind of worked wonders, because What they've managed to do is at the cost of, well, okay, at the cost of a full inch and a half of belt armor, which is considerable, they've kept the same speed and same tonnage, same main armament, but they've gotten it up to 8 8-inch guns. So, yeah, I mean, what they've done is the difference is they've removed an inch and a half of belt armor and shoved in another 6 8-inch guns. And that does change the equation. It's clearly more fragile. It will probably age worse because it's more vulnerable to things. But it's got more hitting power. 8 8-inch and 8 6-inch guns is a pretty substantial secondary battery. Maybe even enough to make up for the lack of the extra two 12-inch guns, although I would really probably still try to have the extra two 12-inch guns before I shoved more and more secondaries on. But considering how much trouble battleship guns at this moment have with penetrating armor of this sort of thickness, this is almost certainly a better design, actually. Like, I think they made a good compromise choice there. Shame they built more Henry the Fourth than they did these. And then most recently, 1899, they've built Condorcet and Mirabeau, which are smaller at 11,600 tons, but they make 16 knots. They have a 16.5-inch belt. They evidently have a bridge that's wider than the ship. They have four 13-inch guns and two twin turrets. Their speed is fine. Their armor is outstanding. Weirdness aside, their armament is also good. Well, their primary armament is good. The issue with these is their secondary, tertiary armament. Very good against torpedo boats, not good at all against cruisers. The blind spot of this ship is going to be like light to armored cruise, like light cruisers in essence, which would have a good chance of maybe slipping up and firing a submerged torpedo or something into them because unless they get a lucky 13-inch hit, those 4 and 2-inch guns are not going to be able to do enough to deter them. And that belt will not do very much at all against any battleship in this era. Will be crippled by one torpedo, maybe even sunk. Surely sunk by 2 or more torpedoes. There's just no torpedo protection yet. I don't hate this design because the speed and the armor is great, and the primary armament is very good. But this secondary armament is a little suspect. Secondary and tertiary. It's a little, small caliber. But it's not bad. It's really not. However, it's the opposite of the direction of the semi-dreadnought that I'm moving towards. Okay, last but not least, folks. Great Britain. 39 battleships. Not quite at the 2-power standard. They don't have as much as Germany and France put together, but they're not even that far from it. Germany, they're maybe 60, 70,000 tons short of it. First of all, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. They have built a 13-ship class of Howe-class battleships. Howe, Rodney, Collingwood, Anson, Camperdown, Benbow, Empress of India, Royal Sovereign, Repulse, Renown, Resolution, Redoubtable, and Centurion. Unfortunately, this is a weird class. I mean, okay, 17 knots, good. 10.5 inches of belt armor. Not great, not terrible. They have 3 13-inch guns with a twin turret fore and a single turret aft. Basically no substantial secondary or tertiary armament. I mean, maybe enough to keep your 300-ton torpedo boats off in small numbers. It's not so god-awful as to be useless, but it's really kind of suspect. The speed is good, but the armor is a little thin for a frontline battleship. It should be fine through the 1890s and even the early 1900s, but obviously, dreadnoughts, well, not even just dreadnoughts, but pre-dreadnoughts with the latest guns will really start to take it apart. And The three 13-inch guns, clearly, I mean, a weight cost compromise, but it would probably be better to have four 12s. It's hard to be sure about that, but I think it would be. And it's unbalanced. The stern is clearly more vulnerable than the front, the bow. But yeah, it's not terrible, but I wouldn't build it. I'm not impressed by it. It's weird to have, an asymmetrical layout like this. I mean, if you were really, really going for it, like a hyper modern Nelson class type thing, that'd be one thing, but I don't think that's what they're intending. I think they're just cheaped out on weight for the fourth gun at the back. They followed that with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Ramillies class battleships. Ramillies, Revenge, Royal Oak, Magnificent, Hood, Barfleur, and Majestic. And these are a little more like it, to be honest. These are 16 knots, 12,500 tons, 14-inch armor belt, very thick, 4 13-inch guns, 2 twin turrets, fore and aft. The only issue that these have is that their secondary and tertiary armament is quite light, but it should be enough to deter torpedo boats, maybe even a little bit of cruisers, especially in a massed line like Britain's going to have, and they really should have screens anyway. They don't have any shortage of them. And, I mean, these are good. These are quite good battleships, I would say. Secondary and tertiary armament is a little light, but the armor thickness is great. The speed is good. And they're even on a pretty reasonable size and budget, made possible by the light secondary tertiary, but quite nice. I like these. They followed that with 4 Victorious class, Victorious, Jupiter, Mars, and Illustrious, 1893 to 94. God, they're building at least 3, if not in peak years, 5 new battleships a year. These are a lot more problematic now. Okay, they still make 16 knots, which is basically, I guess, Britain's going for that as their standard speed, which makes a lot of sense, at least for early pre-dreadnoughts. 11-inch belts, slightly thin, not terrible. Obviously, the issue is 4 10-inch guns. Now, Britain built a Centurion class of battleships that was very much like this in real life. And the purpose of them was for colonial duties, and that makes a lot of sense. In certain regard. I mean, let's put it this way. A lot of other powers, arguably, now it depends, let's see where they actually got them. North American East Coast, one of them is Northern Europe. I doubt the AI is actually smart enough to use them that way, to be honest, but I could see the argument for these on the basis that they're a luxury Britain can afford that everybody else can't. To have 4 or 5 dedicated small battleships that you can send out to the colonies that will just take apart everybody else's, they can't necessarily chase down armored cruisers, but nobody else's colonial armored cruisers or protected cruisers will be able to stand and fight against these things. They're pretty much invulnerable to them. So they're almost like an I win button for a colonial conflict unless somebody else sends their battleships out, but they can't afford to because they need everything to fight Britain at home. Britain alone has the spare resources to maybe be able to build dedicated colonial-sized battleships, which is basically what these are, yeah. And there's only 4 of them, so to have that many, not a huge chunk out of their 39 battleship budget, honestly. They follow that with 7 Caesar class, which are the only battleships the AI has built that are bigger than my Oklahoma class and as big as my Arizona class. So that's something. Caesar, Hannibal, Formidable, Implacable, London, Irresistible, and Bulwark. 15,000 tons, 16 knots. Okay. 4 12-inch guns, 12 7-inch guns, 18 3-inch guns. So you'll note in most regards identical to my Arizonas at the same weight. Literally 412, 12.7, 18.3, 16 knots, right down to the. Well, then there's the glaring issue: 7.5-inch belt, 2/3 of the armor of an Arizona. Now, built 5 years earlier, so there's your difference for you. But it's really a little thin. I mean, in 1895, exceptionally powerful battleship. Like, with this secondary armament, which is a lot, plus good speed, good primary armament, terrifying. The problem is that this belt, as gunnery technology improves, this belt is going to become more and more vulnerable to a much greater extent than a 12-inch belt will. So the Caesars have, like, for the last 5 years, and probably even still right now in 1900, at least until my Arizonas are finished, these Caesar class are the kings of the ocean. Although my Oklahoma class has more armor, with their much lighter secondary armament, I would not bet on them against these Caesars at this point in the sort of state of gunnery technology. So I would say for the last, since these were built, kings of the ocean. But not only will my Arizonas momentarily surpass them, they're going to age worse than a lot of other, like, give it a couple of years, and a refitted Ramilias here with a little more secondary armament might actually end up being a more powerful battleship because of the much better armor. Because of how gunnery technology has improved. Gun technology, that is. Literal gun building as opposed to gun accuracy. So they followed those with 6 Venerable class. Venerable, Dreadnought, Queen, Prince of Wales, Goliath, and Albion. Oh, and these sort of jump back to, like, their older style. In fact, they quite resemble the Howe class. 3 13-inch guns with the 2 fore and 1 aft. The difference being a knot faster at 18 knots, half an inch less of belt armor, but then with 4 7s and 10 2s. I mean, the Howes could get away with this a little more in 1890. The Venerables, thinner armor, more speed, but thinner armor, bit heavier secondaries, but maybe not enough of them to really make a huge difference. I mean, these still aren't terrible, terrible battleships, but they're definitely flawed, I think. I mean, compared to one of these Caesars, although the Caesars do have even 2.5 inches less of belt armor, I think the Caesars are between the main guns maybe are ultimately a wash. But I'd rather have the extra 1 than the extra inch, probably. But the much heavier secondaries on these gonna make them better ultimately. However, these could run away. 18 knots is pretty nice. So I mean, they're not hopeless. They're just a little weird. And most recently, they've built Glory and Ocean, and they're building 2 more of those. And these are small at 10,800 tons, 16 knots. They're trying to do the almost like semi dreadnought thing on a budget, because they've got 16 knots, they got 4 13-inch guns, they got 10 7-inch guns, which the new trend in secondaries, 16 2-inch guns. But then that 8.5-inch belt, it's a bit better than a Caesar. And in fact, it's interesting. With the 4 13-inch guns and the 10 7-inch guns, it's marginally smaller secondary tertiaries than a Caesar, but a heavier primary armament, and a thicker belt on the same speed, and 4,200 tons less. I don't know how they pulled off that much weight reduction. This must have low freeboard or something, probably. But pound for pound, this is probably better than a Caesar. And it would have a good fighting chance against a Caesar one-on-one because of the slightly better armor and the heavier main guns, despite the slightly weaker secondaries, tertiaries. I just almost have to assume there's some kind of big compromise additional being made in terms of range or freeboard or something to shave 4,200 tons off compared to the Caesar from, 4 years prior. But time will tell, maybe. Anyway, that finally brings us to the end. I would say, well, hopefully it's been interesting for some of you naval geeks. It probably will be. Obviously, not real ships, and some of them are clearly pre-generated designs, but some of what the AI dynamically comes up with is quite interesting, and I like comparing all of them. Britain is still on top for now, very clearly, and they have the most powerful battleships in the world, I would say. France actually has some pretty good designs. I like the unique Austria-Hungary has actually taken. I assume they're programmed to do this, but I like the very unique approach they've taken with their fleet, their battleships, and their fleet composition in general. I think all of our modern ships are very competitive with what everyone else has. Maybe we should build some less torpedo boaty destroyers, but I think that's coming probably already in the campaign, from what I remember. I think we're in a good position in terms of quality, just not in terms of numbers, and that will come, to some extent at least. So I hope it's been an interesting look at the fleets of the world for you. Janda's All the World's Fighting Ships, as it'll be titled. It's been good to have you here. If you have watched this whole way, I know it's been 2 hours probably. Thanks for watching, sailors. We will see you next time. Goodbye.